I've animated all the parts I wanted to animate by keyframing through the timeline, and now I'd like to animate the little arm that goes on the top of our creature. Now I've separated it out and put it over by itself so that it's clear what we need to do here. I'm going to duplicate the cylinder and the sphere to make the second half of this arm. But before I do that, I'm going to shift select them, and I'm going to hold down the space bar. I'm going to go to mesh, and I'm going to choose combine. I'm going to delete by type history, and now I'm going to duplicate that whole piece. I'm going to hit Command D, and I'm going to drag that down so the edge of the duplicate cylinder is embedded in the very first sphere. So we're going to take a look at how we can put in bones and then the IK kinematics, which will allow us to articulate that model. Now, while I'm at it, I'm going to also combine the cone to the cylinder at the front. I'll go to Mesh, and I'll choose Combine. Once again, center the pivot and delete by type history. So now we've got two simple pieces that are going to make it easy to parent it to the bones that we're going to create. I'm going to go to the side view to do this because I have to make sure I put the bones in an orthographic view. I'm going to hold down the space bar, and I'm going to go to skeleton, and I'm going to choose create joints. Now I'm going to create my very first joint down well below where the actual arm shape is. Then I'm going to go up and I'm going to click again at that first sphere. I'm going to click again at the second one here, and then I'm going to click right at the tip of the cone. Now once I've put the bones in and I click, you'll see that you can select these separate little joints through these little circle shapes that you see in your side view. These are parented by default, and what that means is if I click on the very first one I introduced, I can now move the whole skeleton. And that's going to be very important because at one point when we're done articulating the arm, we're going to parent the whole model to this bone. And then the arm and the model will behave as one. You'll also notice that the bones that are introduced in this order are topped by this pyramid. So it means that any bones to the right, where you see this triangle come to a point, it is parented to the previous bone. So when I click on a bone and then move it, you can see now that everything that follows it is parented to it. So once again, if I click on the very first one we introduced, the whole skeleton moves. Now we're going to introduce IK kinematics. But before we do, I want to manage the size of the bones, just visually. So I'm going to hold down the space bar, and I'm going to go to Display, Animation, and then I'm going to choose Joint Size. And with the joint size, now I can reduce or increase depending on what my needs would be. Now this has no bearing on the animation, it's strictly visual. So once I've got the bones as size I want, I'm going to go in and make sure that these little joint circular elements are exactly where I want. So I want this to articulate at that sphere. So I'm going to make sure that each of these are on there. Now, if I move the one to the left now, you'll see everything to the right moves as well. And that may not be desirable. But if I hold down D, just as I move a pivot, I can also move bones and their joints separately. So once I have pretty much what I want, I'm going to save. Now we're going to introduce an element called inverse kinematics. I'm going to hold down the space bar. If you go to skeleton again, you'll see create IK handle. I'll simply click on the word IK handle. Now I'm going to start by clicking where this thing will be stationary over the top of our model, which is this joint. It's the main joint, as if it were a shoulder. Now I'm going to click on the very last one, and you'll see a rubber band shape has been introduced, and also some brown lines. So if I was to go to my perspective view, my bones are brown, but they're brown lines at the very last joint. And what that means is now I can click and drag, and you'll see now that once we parent our geometry to this skeleton, that it will articulate like an arm. Now, once again, I'm going to check the size of those brown lines. Very often the lines are much too small and you can't click on them to drop the keyframes, which we will do next. So I will hold down the space bar and I will go to display again, and I'll go to animation again, and I'll go to IK handle size. And in here, I can make it smaller or larger depending on my needs. I want it large enough so I can grab it easily. Now I'm going to go in and I'm going to parent the pieces of geometry from this arm to the respective bone. Now, if you remember with parenting, you always select the piece that is going to follow. In this case, I want my geometry to follow the position of this bone. So I'm going to select the geometry, I'll shift select the bone, and I'll hit P to parent. I'm going to select the forearm, and I'll shift select the bone that is going through it, and once again I'll hit P to parent. Now if I was to go to the very edge where that series of brown vertices are coming, and I click and drag, the geometry now follows the IK kinematic. You'll notice that in your channels window that for translate, the key positions are changing, and we're going to be able to keyframe that however we choose. Now that we have our entire model keyframed, it's time to assemble it. So I'm going to go to my top view, and I'm going to create a NURB circle. And I'm going to go to my perspective view now, and I'm going to drag it down to the bottom of my little creature. I'm going to select the very first bone that I introduced. I'll click on it, and then I'm going to shift select the circle, and I'm going to hit P to parent. And what this means is that now when I select that circle, the arm will move about if I need to keyframe my animation across the screen. Next, I'm going to select my grouped model by clicking on one of the elements and hitting the up arrow. And I'm going to move this into position in relationship to that little arm where I might want it to attach to my creature. With that group selected, I'm going to shift select the very first bone we introduced, and I will hit P to parent. Now if I click on the NURB circle, I can now manipulate the whole model in space. Now I'm going to animate the arm. And it's the same as animating any other object. I'm going to use the timeline by setting keyframes. So I'll select the brown vertices that radiate from the very tip, which are attached to the IK function. I'll put my playback head at the beginning. And I'm going to set translate XYZ with keyframes. I'm going to retract the arm kind of up over the top of the model. So I'll pull it up and across like so. And then I'm going to go to frame 25 and I'll click and drag it out perhaps and down a little. And then once again, I'll shift select my keyframe, copy, and then I'll go to frame 50 and I'll go to paste. Now, I've got this kind of darting out and flying, And once again, I can go to my graph editor, and with that translate XYZ selected, clicking and dragging through, I can go to curves, post-infinity, cycle. Now there's one last thing we need to parent. Once I have the arm articulating, if I were to now select the NURB circle and move my creature through space, the arm stays stationary where it was first keyframed. I'll select the brown vertice, I'll shift select the NURB circle, and I'll hit P to parent. That assures me that wherever our critter goes, the arm will follow and it will animate on its own.